Ready for a deep dive into the world of bread? We're going beyond your average sandwich today and exploring the journey of bread itself. From those golden wheat fields to the crispy crust of a baguette, it's a surprisingly complex story.
And to help us along on this journey, we have a fascinating guide, a vintage film from the 1920s called From Wheat to Bread, which is preserved in the Library of Congress archives. It's a real time capsule, showing us how bread was made back then, at a time when technology was starting to change the relationship people had with their food.
Okay, a 1920s bread film. Now that's something I'd love to see. I'm picturing like grainy footage and maybe a jaunty piano soundtrack.
You got the right idea.
Yeah.
But what's really fascinating is that the film wasn't just meant to be entertainment, you see. It was actually intended to educate people about how their daily bread was made. It gives us this incredible glimpse into a time when the industrial production of food was still a pretty new concept.
Yeah, when you put it that way, I bet knowing where your food came from back then wasn't as simple as just, reading the back of a package. Did this film start at the very beginning, like with the actual wheat itself?
Absolutely. From wheat to bread takes us right back to the basics. Imagine, grinding grains by hand between stones, a practice that had remained largely unchanged for centuries. The film then contrasts this with the new emerging technologies of the time, which is really something.
So are we talking about the rise of those picturesque water mills you see on postcards? I remember learning about the huge impact they had on grain production.
You got it. Water mills were a game changer, for sure. But the film takes it a step further and showcases the mechanized flour mills of the early 20th century. Think massive sifters, purifiers. These incredible machines that must have seemed revolutionary back then compared to the traditional methods. With these machines, they could achieve a level of precision and efficiency in flour production that had never been seen before.
Wow, it's mind-blowing to think about how those innovations basically paved the way for the modern mills we rely on today.
It was a real turning point. But as impressive as those early mills were for their time, the technology described in Bread from Humble Seed to Sizzling Loaf, well, it takes us light years ahead. We're not just talking about grinding wheat into flour anymore. This is a complex process involving cleaning, separating, refining, all to create a whole range of flour types, each with specific properties for different baking needs. Imagine going from a basic millstone to a high-tech laboratory.
You've definitely painted a vivid picture there. That kind of technological leap really makes you appreciate the science behind something we often take for granted.
Absolutely. But while the tools have certainly evolved over time, that core process of transforming grain into flour remains a fundamental step in our bread journey.
And speaking of that journey, from wheat to bread doesn't just stop at the flour mill, does it? It shows the actual baking process, too.
Precisely. And this is where it gets even more interesting. While our modern source, Bread from Humble Seed to Sizzling Loaf, details the more traditional techniques of mixing, kneading, and shaping techniques that are still used today, by the way, the film offers us a glimpse into how these very processes were being adapted for mass production.
That makes sense, given that this was the era of factories and assembly lines, right? Did the film actually show these large-scale bakeries in action?
It did. And it's this powerful visual reminder that even as technology was changing the world, those essential steps in bread making, those human elements of the craft, they remained surprisingly constant. When you see those bustling bakeries in the film, it really highlights something crucial about that era, the 1920s, right? A time of immense change, both socially and technologically. Think about it. People were moving from rural communities to these big cities, and the Industrial Revolution was, it was transforming just about every aspect of life, including how their food was made.
So it wasn't just about showing people here's how bread is made, it was also addressing a sort of cultural shift that was happening at the same time.
Exactly. Imagine, if you will, you're a city dweller in the 1920s, maybe you just arrived from a farm, and suddenly you're surrounded by factories and mass-produced everything. It must have been almost magical, but also a little unsettling, And this film, it served as a sort of bridge between the familiar and this new world.
It's fascinating how something as simple as a loaf of bread could be at the heart of that kind of cultural shift. Makes you wonder if the filmmakers were trying to ease anxieties about where their food was coming from in this new industrial age, right?
It's very possible. And what's even more interesting is that From Wheat to Bread wasn't just some one-off project. It was actually created by Eastman Teaching Films, a company founded by, get this, George Eastman, the man behind Kodak cameras.
Wow, talk about a visionary. Although I guess it makes sense, right? Eastman, he understood the power of visual storytelling. So, using film to educate people about something as essential as bread, well, it was pretty groundbreaking for its time.
Absolutely. And you know what? Its message continued to resonate. In the 1940s, Encyclopedia Britannica films, they actually re-released From Wheat to Bread, introducing it to a whole new generation.
Wasn't that right after World War II? The timing seems significant if you think about it. The focus on rebuilding, food security, all that in those post-war years. Bread, as a symbol of sustenance, stability, well, it must have taken on an even deeper meaning then, right?
Precisely. It reminds us that even something as fundamental as bread can hold different meanings, different importance, depending on the cultural and historical context you see. And From Wheat to Bread, well, through its simple narrative, it captures that essence really beautifully. But it's not just the history and the technology that makes bread so compelling, is it?
You're right. There's something almost primal, I think, about our connection to bread. Both From Wheat to Bread and Bread from Humble Seed to Sizzling Loaf, they mention this intoxicating aroma of baking bread, the way it just engages our senses.
But exactly, it's visceral. The sight of those golden wheat fields, the feel of freshly baked bread, that unmistakable aroma, it just triggers something deep within us, I think. And then there's the taste, the texture, that perfect balance between a soft, yielding crumb and a crisp, satisfying crust.
It's no wonder that bread is such a staple food in cultures all around the world. It transcends borders, languages, it speaks to our most basic human need for nourishment and comfort.
And don't even get me started on its versatility. Bread can be a blank canvas for flavors, the foundation of a hearty sandwich, a vessel for dipping, or simply enjoyed on its own. It adapts to any occasion, any culture.
It's funny, as we've gone on this journey from ancient wheat fields to those bustling bakeries of the 1920s, I keep thinking about how our relationship with bread has changed over time.
It really is fascinating, isn't it? It's like this paradox. We have access to more variety, more convenience than ever before, and yet, that connection to the actual process, that understanding of what goes into each loaf, well, it can sometimes get lost in all that, I think.
It reminds me of that line from Bread from Humble Seed to Sizzling Loaf, how even the simplest loaf of bread represents generations of knowledge and tradition. It really makes you realize that we're part of something much bigger.
Precisely. And that story, it's not just about sustenance. Bread's always held a much deeper meaning for us, for humanity. Think about the role it plays in rituals and ceremonies in different cultures around the world. You've got communion wafers, the braided challah bread, so many examples. It often symbolizes something, greater than itself, I'd say.
You're right. It's like a shared language, the symbol of community and connection that goes beyond borders and cultures. Heck, we even use it in our metaphors, right? Like when we talk about the breadwinner of the family.
Exactly. Bread, in so many ways, represents the foundation of society itself, the sustenance that lets us thrive, connect with each other. And that's a pretty powerful message even today, I think.
It really is. So as we savor the final crumbs of this deep dive, is there one takeaway you hope our listeners will hold on to?
The next time you're holding a loaf of bread, just pause for a moment. Take a moment to appreciate the journey it took to get to you. Think about those golden wheat fields, those amazing machines in the mills, the hands that kneaded and shaped that dough. It's a good reminder that even the simplest things have a story to tell.
And hey, maybe it might even inspire you to try baking your own bread someday. It's such a rewarding experience, really connects you to those generations past and present, and who knows, you might even discover a hidden talent for it.
Absolutely. And if you're curious to learn even more about the history of bread making, I highly recommend checking out that vintage film we've been discussing, From Wheat to Bread. It's like a window into another time, a reminder of how something as simple as food can connect us all. You can find it in the Library of Congress archives, online.
A delicious slice of history. Until next time, keep exploring and happy baking, everyone.